The last time the southern San Andreas produced a major earthquake, Andrew Jackson was still alive. That is not a figure of speech. It happened in 1857, which means the fault has now gone 169 years without releasing the strain that two tectonic plates have been quietly building beneath it every single day since. A study published last month finally put a hard number on that buildup, and the number is the highest fault stress measured anywhere in Southern California in the last 1,000 years. Not the highest in a decade, not the highest since the last big one, the highest point in a 1,000-year record. What that means for the people living on top of it is what we're going to walk through right now. The study came out in the Journal of Geophysical Research, and it reaches a conclusion that changes how we should think about the ground under Los Angeles, San Bernardino, and the Inland Empire. A team of researchers reconstructed roughly 1,000 years of movement on the region's major fault systems and found that the San Andreas and the San Jacinto Fault are both carrying more accumulated stress right now than at any point in that entire reconstruction. That's the finding, stated as plainly as it can be stated, and it's landing at a strange moment because for weeks the news has been full of earthquakes happening elsewhere in the world, and a lot of people have started asking whether something is shifting globally. The honest answer is no. The planet is not becoming more seismically active, and the worldwide rate of large earthquakes hasn't moved. What has changed is our ability to measure the internal state of one specific, densely populated fault system. And what that measurement just showed us is not comforting. So today, we're going to go through what the study actually found, how the researchers managed to calculate a number that nobody has ever been able to put on paper before, and why a stretch of ground about 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles has quietly become the most closely watched fault junction in the country. Then we're going to look at two real earthquakes, both from this year, on opposite sides of the planet, because set side by side, they tell you almost everything you need to understand about what this finding means for the millions of people who live directly on top of these faults. The research grew out of a group connected to the University of Bern in Switzerland, working alongside Kate Scherer, a geologist with the United States Geological Survey, who has spent much of her career reading the physical evidence of past California earthquakes out of the rock itself. That detail matters, because the fundamental problem with studying any fault is that the thing you most want to measure is invisible. You cannot see stress building underground. You cannot sink a sensor 12 kilometers down and get a live readout of how close a fault is to failure. What you can do is reconstruct its past, and if you reconstruct enough of that past with enough precision, you can model where the fault sits today relative to everything that came before it. To get there, the team built what they call a physics-based four-dimensional model of the fault system, 3 dimensions of space plus time, and they fed it with 3 independent lines of evidence. The first was radiocarbon dating, which lets researchers pin down roughly when past ruptures disturbed sediment layers in the ground. The second was tree ring analysis, since old trees near fault zones can carry physical growth disruptions caused by historic earthquakes, giving scientists a natural, centuries-long timestamp. The third was the documented historical record, the ruptures we actually have written accounts of, or clear geological scarring for. Weave those 3 threads together, and you can run the clock backward, across roughly 1,000 years, reconstructing which segment of the fault moved, how far it moved, and how much strain has been silently rebuilding in the time since. This approach matters because a single earthquake on its own tells you almost nothing useful. One rupture is an anecdote. 1,000 years of ruptures is a pattern, and a pattern lets you see the actual rhythm a fault settles into, the pace at which it loads up with strain and then releases it. Faults don't fail on a tidy schedule, but over centuries they do fall into a rough average recurrence interval, and knowing exactly where a fault currently sits within its own rhythm is worth far more than simply knowing, in the abstract, that it's capable of producing a large earthquake someday. That's the real leap this model makes. It doesn't just say these faults can produce a major quake. It says where they currently sit on the curve between the last big one and the next. When the researchers laid today's stress levels against that 1,000-year rhythm, the present moment didn't land somewhere in the comfortable middle of the range. It landed at the very top. According to the model's own reconstruction, the system hasn't simply been climbing toward a dangerous level. It has, by this measure, already climbed past the highest point anywhere in the entire record. That's a subtle distinction, but an important one. There's a real difference between a fault approaching a threshold and a fault that has already exceeded every value the reconstruction can find across 1,000 years of history. Southern California's major faults, according to this study, fall into the second category. The strain waiting to come out has already surpassed anything on file. Break the finding down by segment, and one stretch stands out above the rest. The section of the San Jacinto Fault running near San Bernardino registered the highest stress value found anywhere in the entire 1,000-year reconstruction, sitting at roughly 3.6 megapascals. That figure exceeds the segment's previous peak, which the model dates to roughly 50 years ago. So this isn't a fault that has always sat at this level and simply never let go. It's a fault that has climbed to a new high, one it hasn't reached in centuries, and it's still rising. Right next to it, the southern San Andreas tells a complementary story. And it's a story told through absence rather than accumulation. The last time that stretch of the San Andreas ruptured in a major event was 1857 in what's known as the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated at roughly magnitude 7.9. That was 169 years ago, and in all the time since, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate have kept grinding past one another at roughly 5 centimeters a year, with none of that accumulated motion released in a major quake. Sit with what that actually means. For over a century and a half, the fault has been winding tighter, 1 slow centimeter at a time, and it hasn't paid any of it back. Here's the part that makes this study genuinely different from things seismologists already knew. Nobody is claiming either fault is overdue in isolation. Scientists avoid that word since faults don't keep appointments. What's new is that both systems are at their highest stress all simultaneously, and that they run close enough together at one location to interact. A single loaded fault is a hazard we understand. 2 loaded faults side by side, both near the top of their range, close enough to touch, is a different category of problem. And the place where they come closest has a name. It's called Cajun Pass, a mountain corridor roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles near San Bernardino. If you've ever driven Interstate 15 between Los Angeles and Las Vegas, you've driven straight through it without a second thought. Beneath that pass, the San Andreas and San Jacinto fault systems come very close to one another, and the study identifies this junction as what researchers call an earthquake gate. Understanding that term is really the whole point, so let's walk through it carefully. When an earthquake starts, the rupture doesn't automatically travel the entire length of a fault. It begins at a single point and races outward along the fault line, and normally it stops when it hits some kind of structural boundary, a place where the geometry changes or where the neighboring segment happens to be carrying a very different level of stress. That boundary functions like a circuit breaker. It's the reason most earthquakes stay contained to a single segment instead of unzipping an entire fault system end to end. The gate, in other words, is usually closed, but a gate can open when 2 neighboring fault systems are both loaded to similarly elevated levels at the same time. That boundary stops functioning as a reliable stopping point. Instead of halting a rupture, it can let the rupture jump across. A quake that begins on the San Andreas could leap the gap at Cajun Pass and continue onto the San Jacinto, or the reverse, chaining 2 separate fault systems into one much larger event. And what this study found is that the present stress conditions at Cajun Pass are exactly the conditions under which that kind of jump becomes plausible. Because both systems are near the top of their range at the same time, the boundary between them is weak. The gate, in the researcher's own language, is unlocked. And an unlocked gate is the difference between a serious regional earthquake and a catastrophe that hits several cities in the same violent minute. If a rupture did jump that gate and chain the 2 systems together, the researchers estimate the resulting earthquake could fall somewhere between magnitude 7.4 and 7.8. To understand why that range is so alarming, you have to understand how the magnitude scale actually behaves, because it doesn't work the way most people instinctively assume. The moment magnitude scale is logarithmic, each whole step up the scale represents roughly 10 times the ground shaking amplitude and roughly 31 to 32 times the energy released. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake doesn't release a little more energy than a magnitude 6.5. It releases somewhere around 31 times more. Now place an earthquake in that range, not out in some empty desert, but running directly through the neighborhoods northeast of Los Angeles, along faults that pass beneath and beside dense population centers. A joint rupture at that magnitude wouldn't threaten a single city in isolation. It would threaten the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley more or less at the same time, because the fault system physically runs through all of them. This is exactly what separates the earthquake gate scenario from the standard mental image most Californians already carry around of the big one. It isn't one fault failing on its own, it's 2 faults, connected, releasing well over a century of stored strain across a wide stretch of Southern California simultaneously. There's a second consequence of rupture length that's easy to overlook beyond the raw energy involved. A longer rupture shakes the ground for longer. A moderate earthquake might shake violently for a handful of seconds. A great rupture that unzips segment after segment can keep shaking for a minute or more. Buildings that would survive 10 seconds of violent motion can start to fail once that same motion continues for 60 seconds. Duration is its own separate hazard, and a gate-jumping rupture that chains 2 fault systems together is, almost by definition, a longer and therefore longer shaking event. Those extra seconds are exactly when weakened structures finally give out, when soft first floors buckle, and when the line between a cracked wall and a full collapse gets decided. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear a number like magnitude 7.8 and mistake it for a prediction. It isn't one. The study isn't claiming this earthquake is coming next week or next year. What it's saying is that the fault system is now loaded to a degree that makes this scenario worth actively planning for, rather than filing away as a remote worst case. The stress is real, it's measured, and by this reconstruction, it's at a 1,000-year high. What it cannot tell you, no matter how good the model is the date. And that gap between knowing a fault is dangerously loaded and knowing when it will actually break is arguably the single most important thing to understand about earthquake science, and exactly why preparation matters so much more than prediction ever will. Los Angeles isn't a blank slate waiting passively to receive whatever comes next. It's a specific city with specific, well-documented vulnerabilities, and this study matters precisely because of what already sits on top of these faults. The greater metropolitan area holds more than 13 million people. Its building stock includes a large inventory of what engineers call soft-story buildings, apartment structures, many from the 1960s and 70s, built with weak ground floors, often with open parking tucked underneath the living space above. Those buildings are known to perform badly in strong shaking because the weak first floor can collapse and bring everything above it down along with it. Utility lines, including gas mains, cross active fault traces in multiple places, which is exactly how shaking in the ground turns into fire in the streets afterward. There's a more hopeful side to this ledger. California has some of the strongest seismic building codes in the world for new construction, and the region runs an early warning system called Shake Alert, which detects the fast, low-damage initial waves of an earthquake and sends an alert before the slower, destructive waves arrive. Depending on distance from the epicenter, that can buy a few seconds to tens of seconds of warning. Enough for a surgeon to pull back a scalpel, a train to begin breaking, a child to get under a desk. Seconds save lives. The problem is the gap between the new and the old. Modern buildings are engineered for this. The vulnerable older ones, soft-story apartments, unreinforced masonry, are being retrofitted slowly and unevenly, and funding for that work has always been a political fight. That gap between buildings that will ride out a major rupture and ones that won't is exactly where the human toll would concentrate. Which brings us to the part of this story that isn't a model or projection, but something that has already happened twice this year on opposite sides of the planet. On June 24th of this year, two large earthquakes struck Venezuela within about 39 seconds of each other. The second and larger of the two measured magnitude 7.5, and both were shallow, at a depth of only around 10 kilometers. Depth matters enormously here. When a rupture that shallow sits directly beneath populated ground, the energy reaches the surface with almost nothing to absorb it along the way. In the Itá, coastal region north of Caracas, reporting indicated that roughly 80% of buildings collapsed. As of early July, the confirmed death toll stood at around 3,500, with more than 16,000 injured and tens of thousands still unaccounted for, and independent observers described the true figure as likely substantially higher than the official count. That's what a magnitude 7.5 does when it hits a place that was never built to withstand it. Poverty, deferred, maintenance, unenforced building standards, and no functioning early warning system all stacked on top of each other. And when the ground moved, the buildings simply didn't hold. The country was already in a humanitarian crisis before either earthquake struck, its health system strained, and its infrastructure fragile, which is another way of saying the disaster didn't begin the moment the fault ruptured. It had been assembled piece by piece over years out of conditions that turned what should have been a survivable event into something far worse. Hold that image in your mind, because now we're going to look at an earthquake of almost exactly the same size that produced an almost unrecognizably different outcome. The comparison is the entire point, and it's the reason this California study should be read not as a death sentence, but as a warning that still leaves plenty of room for a choice. Earlier this year, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan, along the same offshore trench responsible for some of the largest earthquakes in the country's history. Like the Venezuela event, it was shallow, at roughly 10 kilometers of depth. It triggered tsunami warnings, and tens of thousands of people were told to evacuate. By every raw, geological measure, this was a comparable event to what struck Venezuela, a magnitude 7 earthquake in shallow crust near a populated coastline. And here's what it produced. 2 minor injuries, 0 deaths, 0 collapsed buildings. The difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't geology. It was decades of decisions made long before the ground ever started moving. Japan has invested for generations in strict, continually updated seismic building codes. Its newer structures sit on base isolation systems specifically designed to let the ground shift underneath them without tearing the building apart. Its trains brake automatically the instant shaking begins. Its schools run earthquake drills as routine. Its hospitals are engineered to keep functioning through a major event. And its own early warning system gives people those precious extra seconds before the worst of the shaking arrives. None of that is free, and none of it happened by accident. Every base-isolated hospital and every automatically braking train represents money spent and rules enforced. During the long, quiet years between earthquakes, when it would have been easy, politically and financially, to spend that money elsewhere instead. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting inside this comparison. Preparation is expensive and invisible, right up until the exact moment it becomes the only thing that mattered. 2 earthquakes, nearly identical in size and depth, and their death tolls differ by thousands. The variable was never the fault itself. The variable was the choices people made in advance about what to build and how to build it. This is exactly why the California finding matters the way it does. The study tells us the fault system is loaded to a 1,000-year high. It cannot tell us whether Los Angeles, when that gate finally opens, will end up looking more like Japan or more like Venezuela. California currently sits somewhere between those two poles. It has the strong codes and the early warning system that Japan has built. But it also carries the old, unretrofitted buildings and the uneven, underfunded preparation that can turn a survivable earthquake into a mass casualty event. Which of those two outcomes actually plays out isn't written into the rock. It's being decided right now in retrofit budgets, in building inspections, and in the everyday choices people make about how ready they actually want to be. We should be precise about exactly what this study establishes, because precision is what separates useful concern from useless panic. What the research shows is that stress on multiple Southern California fault segments now equals or exceeds the highest value found anywhere in a 1,000-year reconstruction, and that the Cajon Pass junction is loaded in a way that makes a joint rupture a realistic scenario worth planning around. That's a strong, specific, measured finding. What the research does not do and cannot do is tell you when. Earthquake prediction, naming a specific date, place, and magnitude in advance, remains impossible, and nothing in this study changes that basic fact. The researchers themselves are careful about this point. The scientists involved have framed the timing question as today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30 years. Intervals that, at the scale geology operates on, are effectively indistinguishable from one another. Kate Scherer, the USGS co-author, has noted that the accumulated stress is as enormous as it is precisely because it's been so long since either system last had a necessary medication on hand at all times, know exactly where your gas shutoff valve is and how to use it, because gas lines crossing fault traces are exactly how earthquakes turn into fires. Strap down your water heater and your heaviest furniture. Put together a family communication plan, since cell networks reliably fail in the first chaotic minutes after a major quake. And know your evacuation routes before you ever actually need them. What comes next isn't a countdown toward some specific day on a calendar. It's the slow, quiet, ongoing accumulation of strain on 2 fault systems that are already sitting at their highest stress in 1,000 years, with the gate between them unlocked. The ground will move eventually, because that is simply what these faults do, and no study, no matter how good, will ever tell us the exact morning it happens. But the death toll of an earthquake was never fixed by the earthquake alone. It's a geological event multiplied by 1,000 human decisions made in advance, and Venezuela and Japan just showed us, in the starkest possible terms in the very same year, that those decisions are the entire difference between a headline and a catastrophe. The fault is loaded. That part is already out of our hands. What we build, and how ready we are when it finally lets go, is entirely still up to us.